All right, we'll give some time for folks to join. All right, okay. I think we can actually get started right about now. So welcome everyone to UNAVSA's webinar on Census 2020 and its impact to Vietnamese communities. So to just get things started, a little introduction about UNAVSA, or the Union of North American Vietnamese Student Associations. We are a group or coalition. Just making sure, can everyone hear me? Okay. If you are unable to hear really quick, just let us know, or you can follow along in the notes that are at the bottom right corner. So just to backtrack a little bit, we are a coalition of Vietnamese North American young adults, young professionals, and students, and we work across the United States and Canada in order to address a lot of different issues that affect Vietnamese diasporas here across US and Canada. So that's kind of an overview of what we're doing across in North America right now. And more importantly, our focus for this year, on top of electoral organizing, is making sure that other socioeconomic and initiatives that affect Vietnamese communities are being highlighted, and one of them is the Census 2020 for the United States. We are doing this as part of the API 2020 Coalition and the National Week of Action for Census 2020. And we have brought in some experts to talk a little bit more about that. Before we go on though, I'll introduce myself. Sorry it took this long to get to this point. To be able to, we're gonna introduce myself and those who are involved with the webinar. So a little bit about myself. My name is Kat Phan. I am the External Vice President of UNAVSA, and part of what I do is make sure that whatever we're doing within our organization, we are partnered with other groups that are also doing on the ground work for Vietnamese communities, and we are always keeping our eyes out on what is actually affecting our people and those we want to serve. And then I also have Cara on this call as well, if she wants to introduce herself.
Hi, yes, thank you, Kat. I'm Cara. I am on the Civic Engagement Policy Committee of UNAVSA and also part of the Census Committee group to kind of bring awareness of the census and get everyone informed. That's about it. I'll pass it on to our panelists to introduce themselves.
I guess I can start. Hi, everyone. My name is Vincent. I go by he, him. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for VRISE. I'm currently the field lead for our census campaign. I think just a little introduction to myself is I was born and raised in Little Saigon, down in Orange County, California. I ended up going to college up at UC Berkeley. So if there's any folks from Cal Berkeley, go Cal VSA. I was really fortunate enough to, after I graduated back in 2018, I came back to Orange County and I was able to start as an intern for VRISE. Oh, can everyone hear me? Okay. as an intern for VitRise, and then I ended up moving on to become the community engagement coordinator. So a lot of things I do on a day-to-day basis is I'm doing a lot of our research efforts, a lot of our community engagement efforts, just trying to get a better understanding of the Vietnamese community, and also trying to be a liaison between the organization and the community, and then also doing a lot of our housing efforts. That's a little bit about me. I'll pass it on to Anne.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm Anne Le. I currently work for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, but actually I worked on the census in 2010 for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. Yeah, I think that the challenges that we're facing now are so much more significant than what we faced in 2010, even though in 2010 we actually had a very steep effort as well, because the state or the country was recovering from the economic downturn and crisis. And so at that point, we thought that that was, the worst conditions for us to do census outreach, not realizing what we were about to face for this one. So, but I'm happy to talk about the lessons that we've learned, but also just the best practices that we can share for the upcoming. My background is actually, I have done both research and community engagement. I was actually a community engagement project director at Advancing Justice Los Angeles, but I do have a strong research background supporting workers' rights strategic campaigns. And so you'll see from my slides that I'm going to actually go through a lot of data. And frankly, we can't get that data for our communities without the census. So I'm just going to get us started with the first slide. What is the census? And I think that why it's important is going to actually be covered by myself and by Vincent throughout the course of this webinar. But so the next slide, you'll see the first page of the paper form. So this is the sample. So it's very, very basic. It's 9 questions for the primary person. And it's very, very basic information. They're not going to ask for, it's primarily demographics. And so they're not going to ask for information about citizenship, your social security number, bank information, anything like that. So you can see from the first 4 questions that you'll see like how many people are living or staying in this house. So the census will capture who's living. It's oftentimes, I think the analogy that some people have used is that it's America's selfie as of April 1st, 2020. So as of 2020, they want to know how many people are living in a house. And then the second question is if there were additional people that didn't get included in your calculation for the first question. I think that that's partly so that it'll help as a tool to help trigger, like, did you count all the right people? And then the third question is whether the house or apartment or mobile home is something that you own or you rent. And then the fourth question is your telephone number, and that's generally used so that they can follow up with you if they have any questions about what you submitted. So the next slide is actually where it gets a little bit more meaty. You're going to see, and I apologize at how tiny it is, but I am going to go, it is again very basic information. So the 5th question is they ask you for your name. And then question number 6 is what the person's sex is. And then 7 is your age, because they do want to know what your age is as of, to make sure that you are counted as of April 1st. And then question number 8 is the race question, or basically the Latino question, which generally won't apply for folks that are part of UNAVSA. But the 9th question is going to be what your race is. So some things to keep in mind for the form, how you fill it out. For question number 6, asking for the person's sex. So this question is unfortunately a binary question, and you can only check off one box. So if you leave this blank, the Census Bureau will actually impute your response and basically determine your sex for you. So please check off the box that you most closely identify with. This is clearly an issue that we need to address at a policy level for the upcoming censuses like 2030. In contrast, for question number 9, it's the opposite of that. So unlike the single option for sex. Question 9 allows you to check off multiple boxes. So if you're mixed race or if you have multiple ethnic backgrounds or identities, then you can actually have all of those backgrounds reflected in your response to this question. So if it's, as an example, if you're ethnic Chinese but culturally Vietnamese, or any other, any other part of the Chinese diaspora, you can check off multiple boxes to best reflect your ethnic and cultural background. And if your ethnicity or subgroup is not listed, then you can also have the option of writing it in so that we can have much better information about our communities. We want to really encourage people to self-identify so that we have the richest data we can for our communities. So next slide. Yeah, so I'm now going to pass it off to Vince, who will cover how it impacts our communities.
Hi everyone. So I think the census, when we're thinking about the census, it's good that we think about it about the present, how it affects the present, and how it affects the future, but also how it has affected our community in the past. And for the Vietnamese community, it has had a lot of impact on just the creation of a lot of institutions our Vietnamese communities have relied on. So I just wanted to bring up 3 examples of how it's affected us in the past, present, and future. So in the past, for a lot of folks, you already know that the Vietnamese community came here in 1975 and onwards, trying to establish ethnic enclaves that Vietnamese folks can come to find the resources, find the camaraderie to restart their lives in the United States. And then, so one really important aspect that the census played for the Vietnamese community was in the 1980s, 1990s, was allowing our community to have clear, tangible data that says the Vietnamese population in the United States is growing. And then this is why we need the different resources, the different funding to, say, establish Little Saigon. So in the 80s and the 90s, in Orange County at least, when a lot of folks were, a lot of community leaders were trying to push the effort of having California establish Orange County or Garden Grove, Fountain Valley, Santa Ana as Little Saigon. They had to go up to Sacramento, and then they had to present all this data, and then that eventually in I think 1989. That was when finally the governor of California acknowledged that Little Saigon in Orange County is officially established. So from there, when we look at the present, the census, funds so many crucial programs and social services our community relies on. And I think one most important thing for our community here is looking at the senior support. A lot of folks that are growing in older age, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, rely on a lot of different programs that the census is used to help determine the funds for. So one example is if you look at the bottom picture, seniors, refugees, protest closure of Westminster mobile home parks. So, overall, like in our community, there are folks, who are doing well off, but there are other folks who aren't doing so well. And those are the folks that are least likely to fill out the census. And for folks, especially living in mobile home parks, these are folks who are mainly Vietnamese seniors who don't have access to a lot of the different programs that they should and need to be able to kind of live their lives. Like a typical mobile home park would cost maybe $1,000 or maybe less for rent each month. So a lot of these folks, they're relying on their social security income. They're relying on Section 8 housing, which is determined by the census data. And a lot of these folks also rely on, say, like Meals on Wheels to get their nutrition. There's also just to name off just some really important programs is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs. So all in all, like these different programs that the census data will eventually determine the funds for, they're so crucial in order to determine like what is going to happen to our community in the future. Let's see, is everyone able to hear me good? Anyways, so and the last part is for the future. I think one thing that a lot of our community members always talk about when thinking about the future is how do we preserve our culture? How do we preserve our history? So one really important aspect about the census data is that for our community, we've been here for almost 50 years. But up to this point, there hasn't been an officially created like Vietnamese American Museum, so something similar to the Japanese American Museum. So I bring that up that case because in the 1980s, the Japanese American community in Los Angeles, they were able to use a lot of census data to go up to Sacramento in California to lobby and to say that the Japanese community has been living in California for this amount of time. They have been they have contributed this much to California in general. That's why we should create a Japanese American Museum. And because of that data that was available through the census and other data sources, they were able to create a Vietnamese or Japanese American museum. So I think for our community, I think that's one really important aspect that we want to retain and preserve and archive our history and culture. That's one avenue that we can take in order to establish an official Vietnamese American Museum. And then one last thing I forgot to put on the slide was right now we're seeing also an increase of dual immersion classes or courses at the elementary level. So these are schools that are bilingual. They'll teach students Vietnamese in the morning or English in the afternoon or vice versa. So those programs, those are funded and those are created through the census data that is collected. So we've been seeing a lot that's been open ever since 2010. And a lot of those people who had to lobby and to ask for those dual immersion courses to be created had to rely on census data. So that's just like a general gist of why the census is important and why it impacts the Vietnamese community. But I'm going to off to Ann now.
Yeah, so Vincent provided a lot of the really tangible things that reveal how census data is important to us. So I'm actually going to go a little bit into how Vietnamese Americans rely on these census dollars, or the stats that indicate the need for these census dollars for our communities. So this information actually was a lot of this information was drawn from what's called the American Community Survey. So it's not the decennial census data, but it's the data that's collected through what's called the long survey that the Census Bureau puts out on our, so that survey is rolled out on a continuous basis. Some people actually for the census cycle might also be receiving an American Community Survey. These are very long and detailed. But even though some people might think that is very onerous, it's very, very important that we have folks also complete the American Community Survey, because this is the type of rich data that we can get as a result of that. So, my colleagues from Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA partnered with the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center to produce a report that's relatively fresh off the press, and it's called Southeast Asian American Journeys, a national snapshot of our communities. And you can find that on the Advancing Justice Los Angeles website on their publications link. So you can see here the very need for what Vincent really highlighted, which is that 62% of our population is foreign born, which is the most out of all Southeast Asian Americans. And we're nationwide at 49% limited English proficient, which is more than Latinos and Asian Americans as a whole. We have 28% that have a bachelor's degree or higher, and that's in comparison to 50% of Asian Americans as a whole and 31% of whites. We have 16% of our communities uninsured, and 25% are accessing public health insurance. Per capita income is incredibly low at $23,339. Over a third of Viets are either low income or living in poverty, and over a third of Viets are renters. And among those that actually do have mortgages, 45% of them have they are housing cost burdened, which means that they spend a significant amount of their income on their mortgage. So these are really, these stats really reveal the reliance of our communities on programs that are funded by census dollars. But it also helps us to understand where to focus our own programs. So, Vincent and I both work at nonprofit organizations that, have to rely on this type of data to help us understand like we know anecdotally what our communities might be struggling with, but this gives us the data to back it up and support the programs, or figure out how to develop programs that are that could be helpful. But obviously we need an accurate census count, so that emergency services and hospitals can be prepared for, I don't know, things like pandemics, right? Like what we're facing right now. But we should also look at the influence that we have as an electorate. So if you see from the next slide, so this actually shows the influence that Asian Americans as a whole can have on elections. So unfortunately, we don't have this stuff broken down by into ethnic categories, and this is primarily from a report that was issued in 2012 for the general elections in California. So unfortunately, for those that are living, that are participating from outside California, I apologize that these numbers don't reflect your experiences. But you can see here that 25 legislative districts in which there are 25 districts in which Asian Americans make up 25% or more of the electorate. And again, this is again a very, very small text for these slides, but you can see that if you look at these congressional districts or these state districts, you can see that actually Vietnamese Americans make up a significant percentage of these different regions. So you got Santa Clara, Alameda, you got LA focus in San Gabriel Valley, you have San Francisco, you have San Francisco San Mateo, and you have Orange County and LA. So you can just imagine that the Vietnamese American population makes up a sizable part of all of those districts, and so you can think about the impact that that we can make in California elections. And similarly, in the next slide, you can see, so this is about, this slide shows voter registration. So there are 38 districts in which Asian American voter registration exceeded the margin of victory. So this again was from the 2012 elections, but you can see if you look at the numbers, you can see actually that we had a major influence in determining the directs of the election in 2012. So throughout the state, we see real opportunities for influence. So we can go to the next slide. So how does the census impact Vietnamese students? So according to the same study that I pulled from earlier, so you can see that regarding Vietnamese students, specifically in California, there are many needs for that segment of our community. When I say that the segment, I mean students. So again, from the report, we see that limited English proficiency and income play a big role in the lives for our student population. With 50% of our population as limited English proficient, it's not surprising that Vietnamese would be the second most spoken language other than English by students in California. So we only trail Spanish in the schools here as the primary language spoken for our students here. And then in the 2017-18 school year, there were 145 schools in California that had at least 15% of enrolled students who spoke Vietnamese at home. So this basically means that it required schools to provide parental notifications translated in Vietnamese. And then outside of the K through 12 context, so over 50% of Southeast Asian American students are Pell Grant recipients, and that's in comparison to 30% of all UC students. So the first part of the stat was actually applicable for Southeast Asian UC students, I believe. If you look at this as just one part of the challenge of reaching of the need for our overall populations, then you can see, our population our Vietnamese population growth across the country is among the highest in the country. There's a lot of need for different types of programs, bilingual type programs. And so I think having the dual immersion programs that Vincent was talking about is actually really critical for the success of the student population. And we would not know a lot of these things if not for active participation, an accurate count and active participation in the census, so that we can understand the needs for our communities. So I'm now going to actually pass it over to Vincent for the remainder.
All right, thanks, Anne. So I think the next part, I just wanted to talk about a little bit about the holistic assessment of the census funding and how that would impact Vietnamese students. I think when we think about the census, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes we'll think about it, how does it affect me now, and what kind of benefits can I get from it now? But I think being able to look long term, especially in the future, it's going to be very important to see just how impactful the census will be. I think right now the motto for the census is 10 questions for the next 10 years. It's technically not 9 questions, but I think it's catchier with 10 questions. But when we're thinking about the census, in the future, if you decide to have kids, right, you have to think about like how does the census that I take this year in 2020, how is that going to affect, say, 10 years from now? In the next 10 years, we're college students. Maybe in 10 years from now, we might have kids, right? And then a lot of the programs that your kids will end up using, like Head Start, preschool, free and reduced lunches, a lot of these other programs, eventually if they go off to college, a lot of your Pell Grants, a lot of the student loans, that is going to be funded and determined by census data. And then when you think about your family, thinking about your parents and your grandparents and how they're aging, and in the future, if they're going to need those supplemental nutrition programs, they're going to need a lot of these senior programs that if they don't get counted, and I think with the Vietnamese, older Vietnamese population, especially for folks who are living in mobile homes, living in apartments, those are folks who are least likely to float out. And if we miss those populations, those hard to count populations, then 10 years from now, they're not going to have the resources that they need to go on and say live in areas like Little Saigon, where they're able to access their grocery stores, their Vietnamese doctors, Vietnamese lawyers, kind of just the whole community, and then they might be forced to move out if they say lose access to Section 8 housing, or they don't gain access to Section 8 housing. And I think another part is, if folks if folks are having to commute to work, and if you say you're like a car enthusiast, the roads and highways, those get fixed based on the census data. So cities, they will get the tax dollars from the states, and the state will distribute it based on population size. And then from there, the city council, they'll have folks go out and measure like which streets are most used and which streets need fixing. So if you're thinking about it, if you care about the ease of commute, if you care about kind of the conditions of your car, or even the conditions of public transit. Public transit gets a lot of their funding from the federal government, and being able to fill out the census data is going to determine a lot of those fundings for the future. And I think, sometimes as students, we think about things that are happening currently, but I think in the long term, I think that's a very important part to think about. Go to the next slide. Okay, so the next portion that I'm going to cover is, so as Vietnamese students and young adults, what can we do to ensure a fair count? Next slide. So I think one really important thing is, especially now with COVID-19, running rampant, and a lot of us are at home. This is a very opportune time for us to reach out, not only to say like our parents, but to our extended families, to our grandparents, our aunts and uncles, our cousins, nieces and nephews, because with the Vietnamese community, over the past year, whenever we would talk to elder Vietnamese folks, we typically take care of the paperwork in the family. When we tell them that we're transitioning, the census is transitioning to online only. There's the option of phone or paper, but the initial step is they're trying to encourage people to fill out the census online. A lot of those older Vietnamese folks, the elders will say like, I don't have a computer, I don't know how to use the internet. How can I fill out the census if I don't know how to use a computer? And I think that is the crux that could cause a big miscount in our community if we aren't, as young people, aren't urgent, don't have that urgency to, really push and assist of our older members of our community to fill out the census and walk them through step by step on how to take it. And other options is to have them call on the phone. On the phone, they'll be able to have someone in Vietnamese to help translate and help them fill out the whole census. And by paper, that's another option, but it's a little bit more difficult because this year, the census is only going to be offered in English and Spanish in paper. So I think the best option would be online or through phone. Another thing is to ensure a fair count is always remember, Census Day is April 1st. And, Census Day is kind of this arbitrary date that the census has picked. It's changed over the past century which day Census Day is, but that's just a day that the Bureau has determined that when you're filling the census, you want to keep in mind where you're at on April 1st, and then fill that location on your census. There's some caveats with that, and especially for college students that I'm going to address right now. So if you're a college student, you actually want to fill out the census with your the address that you reside at near your college. So if you're living in an apartment near your campus, you want to fill that out because the census wants you to fill out your long-term residency, even though right now you might be at home because of COVID-19. There's a chance if you fill out with your family, they might remove you from the count. So I think that's one thing that you have to be aware of. So just remember to fill out for yourself and also fill it out for your family if they need the help. Because I think this is very crucial because now with COVID-19, a lot of the timeline for the census is being pushed back. So originally the deadline was supposed to be in July 31st, but they've extended it to August 14th. But that's still a very short time. And traditionally in the past, they've always had non-response enumerators. So people will physically go to people's houses to ask them to fill out the census if they haven't yet by May. But because now a lot of states are starting to shut down, those enumerators can't physically come to, say, the Vietnamese elders' household to have them fill out the census. So I think it's even more crucial at this time that in this pandemic that we either help our families or our extended families to fill it out, or we really push them, encourage them to do it. But yes, I'll move it over to Anne.
Thanks, Vincent. So I would say, and I did see a question about how to reach out to smaller Vietnamese American communities where there are smaller population sizes. So I think that the basic template that we use is, one is to identify the trusted messengers within our communities. So Vincent actually, alluded to some of that. Oftentimes it's actually the young people and students within our families that serve as the navigators because of their bilingual abilities for their parents and for their grandparents. So identify, but it could also be, a faith-based leader, or, just like that person within your parents' community that everybody turns to for information about things that they should be, aware of, right? So identifying who the trusted messengers are, and then also, and then the next step is figuring out what messages to use. So the Advancing Justice Affiliation, our DC affiliate, actually had conducted some message testing and found that a focus on family in the future worked well as a general frame for the Vietnamese American community. So that framing actually is can promote participation. So this will likely work for our parents, but it might not work for other parts of the Vietnamese American community. For instance, it might not resonate for as much for the LGBTQ community. But just like knowing the message to use would be really important. And then the other is the avenue or the platform where for how that information can be best consumed. So, there's robust Vietnamese American or Vietnamese language media here in California. But I think for other areas, there might not be. And so I think we want to see if there are YouTube channels or messaging platforms that tend to get used, and we want to pass along messages in a viral way. And I think that that's probably going to be one of the tactics that people and organizations are going to rely heavily upon now that we're sheltering in place or working from home. And I think one of the analogies that gets used a lot is just, the party planning analogy. I don't know if folks have heard this, but it does seem to resonate. So the census is like planning a party. You need to know how many people are coming to make sure that there's enough food. You need to know how many seniors are coming and make sure they have chairs, and how many children are coming and make sure there are enough toys and for childcare. So this is even more important now when we're planning for an emergency, right? So I think that those messages and that type of framework can hopefully work for our communities. But I think what's really important to keep in mind is the timeline. So knowing the timeline is key. And Vincent mentioned this already, but that the timeline has been pushed back, where enumerators will not be knocking on doors just yet, or there's basically been a 2-week delay in a lot of the operations for the fields for the Census Bureau. So you can see here, this is just the current operations timeline. It got modified a couple of weeks ago as a result of COVID-19. But you can see here that the self-response phase started on March 12th when many of us got our first notices in the mail. And we have until August 14th to respond, either online, by phone, or by mail. And then the Census Bureau was also putting out these, they had this plan of hosting these what's called mobile questionnaire assistants. And the theory behind that was that they were going to place Census Bureau staff in these high traffic areas and high traffic in these hard to count areas, or areas where there are hard to count populations and where there have been low response rates. I'm not sure what that program is going to look like now because it's unclear when we will be when the pressures from this pandemic will be lifted or will be eased up. But right now the plan is for early non-response follow-up, or NRFU, to start on May 7th. And my understanding is that that's going to be where the door knockers will be concentrated in the areas by college campuses. And then the actual non-response follow-up for the rest of the areas that are not deemed to be still, I apologize for the dog that's barking in the background, will actually start on May 28th. And so that's actually when enumerators are scheduled to go out in the field and to start door knocking. This actually is going to be a very important non-response follow-up period, unlike in previous years or previous censuses. censuses. We know that response rates have been very low relative to what it was in 2010. You know, I suspect that a lot of that is because of the online format. I know that that is a significant challenge and barrier for the seniors in the Vietnamese American community. So non-response follow-up is basically the phase in which the Census Bureau will start to deploy enumerators that will knock on the doors of the homes that did not that have not completed their census. And this is a critical part of the operation to make sure that we have an accurate count. So it's very, very important that we have that we get participation from our community members, if not before through the self-response phase, then during non-response follow-up. But I will say that if you respond online or by phone or by mail during the non-response follow-up period, then the moment that it gets recorded, your address will be removed in real time from the enumeration list, so you really have until August 14th. So make sure that if your parents or if your family members or your community has not filled out their census forms by May 28th, they shouldn't give up and just assume that an enumerator will come. They can save a lot of costs by just responding to the census in the self-response format. And then the service-based enumeration and the count of people experiencing homelessness outdoors are two timelines that I wanted, or two dates that I wanted to include in this timeline for those of you who are doing any work with populations or know people that are doing work with those populations. I know that in LA there's been a very alarmingly growing, like, larger population of people experiencing homelessness, and so and I think that that's happening across the country, and so I think it's I just wanted to make sure that people knew what that what the timeline for that process was like. And then the census delivers the numbers to the president by December 31st, and the data will be delivered to states for the purposes of redistricting starting on or by April 21st of next year. So I do want to point out, if you look at the next slide, what people should expect if an enumerator comes to their door. Likely they'll be coming roughly between 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. So it's just generally during that time period when they think that you'll be home. You can actually confirm with the Census Bureau Regional Census Office. So you can, if you're not sure, if you have healthy suspicions and you want to confirm that somebody who's knocking on your door actually does work for the Census Bureau, you can get their name and then call the Census Bureau office to confirm that this person actually does work for the Bureau. And if they come, say, at 7 p.m., and by that point the regional office is closed, you can tell them, I want to confirm that that you work for the Bureau. So if you want to come back tomorrow, then you can tell them that. They will make multiple attempts to reach you. If they don't reach you, then they could ask your neighbors or landlord information about you, which sounds very intrusive. Like I said, if you respond during the non-response follow-up period through self-response, your address should be removed from that visit list in real time. So really, we should be just, if people are concerned about enumerators coming to their doors, just make sure that they fill it out on their own. But if an enumerator does come, so again, we need to prepare our family members in our community to actually open the doors if an enumerator does come, because then that way we can ensure an accurate count. And the Census Bureau enumerator will have an ID with them to indicate that they work for the Bureau. They'll have a bag or a laptop, a messenger bag that has the Census Bureau logo on it, and they should also have a letter to indicate that that's what they're there for. They will only ask you the questions that are on the form itself. They won't ask you for supporting documentation. And they will not ask for your driver's license information, social security number, credit card information, money or donation or PIN numbers for anything like that. So there's a lot of rumors of scams that have been going around. So we want to make sure that community members know enumerators will not be coming out until May. and here's how you can identify a census taker. So we need to arm our folks with the knowledge so that they're not fearful, but they're also participating in this process.
All right, thank you, both Amy and Vincent. So just to recap everything that's been stated during this presentation. So the census just takes a little bit of time to complete. Everyone's been saying about 5 to 10 minutes, so expect no more than that upper cap. Obviously, there are exceptions, but this is the average. Everyone should be completing the census. It is constitutionally mandated, so there is no reason why anyone should be trying to convince you or any of your community members otherwise not to complete the census. It influences many, many different resources, informs representation for our own community. So as both of our panelists have noted, whether that means political representation in the electorate, or funding for education, public health resources, etc. It affects so many different elements of our day-to-day lives. So that is a big reason why you should fill it out. And then we did have some questions about whether it is accessible in language, so in this case in Vietnamese, and you can complete it online through this, or you can call in at the phone number 844-461-2020. There are some other languages that may not be represented, but for the time being, Vietnamese is one of the languages that it has been translated and is available to fill out. And then in terms of key messaging points for census, for filling out the census, on top of what you've heard, to recap, it is key to disaster preparedness, as we are clearly seeing with COVID-19. But in case any other major events come up, right, it helps influence decisions about, honestly, which communities to serve, whether or not you agree that's moral, ethical. Next, it also determines all these key allocation funding. And then finally, it helps preserve and archives our own community's history and culture, whether that's funding through museum initiatives or other forms of documentation, research or otherwise. All right, at this time, before we move on to the Q&A portion, thank you so much to everyone for asking questions throughout the webinar, adding in your input too. I know we have a lot of community members on this call coming from across the nation. So I think at this time, I'd like to open up the floor to anyone who would like to mention or promote their own Census 2020 initiatives, especially because this is the Week of Action and Census Day is officially tomorrow. Okay. If you would like to promote your event, then type it in. At this time, I'm going to pass this over to Kara to ask some of the questions that have come up throughout the presentation for our presenters.
Hi, yes, thank you, Kat. Feel free, if any questions pop up, to type in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll be sure to get to it. So throughout the webinar, we had a couple questions. The first one, hi, I'm working in Metro Detroit. We have a Vietnamese American community here, not that large. Any suggestions how to organize a community that is not large but significant that they need to be counted?
So one of the things, Vincent, if you don't mind, I'm going to try to take a stab at this. One of the things that we don't have that problem for the Vietnamese community here in California. Obviously, we have the largest Vietnamese population in the country. But one of the things, like the efforts that I'm a part of actually are to try to promote participation among hard to count Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And so we're struggling with we were struggling with trying to figure out how to reach those smaller populations before COVID-19. And some of the things that we actually thought of and we're thinking about implementing were things like, so the mobile questionnaire assistance, just as an example, I did an outreach event in Pomona, California. It's part of the eastern part of LA County. There's very limited organizational infrastructure out there, nonprofit infrastructure, but there are a good number of sizable Vietnamese Buddhist temples. And so you know, I went out there and I passed out leaflets that were in language, and for the folks that the seniors that I talked to, they were concerned that they were familiar with the census because they completed it 10 years ago, but they were concerned about the online format, right? So one of the things that that we were going to do was actually schedule for a mobile questionnaire assistance to be located at that particular site during a day of service, so that the Census Bureau can help to uh, to uh, help people fill out their forms. So I'm not sure what the mobile questionnaire assistance program will look like whenever it's supposed to be up and running. But I would recommend that that's one way that that you can get the assistance for that for your community there. Another way is you know, just to get the message out. I think one of the ideas that that we were planning on implementing for some of the smaller communities is that you know, for the communities where they have there's very limited organizations, we don't know where they necessarily live, but there are restaurants. We were so I know that some organizations have already put up posters at some of these restaurants that serve these hard to count communities. Now that people aren't going to restaurants anymore, I don't know how that's going to work, but if once I'm hoping that once that restaurants are up and running again, that you can, because there are a lot of videos, there are PSAs, how-tos that are out there for our communities, and so you can make arrangements with the the restaurants or whatever retail service that caters to that population can, you know, air those PSAs just to get the message out. So those are a couple of examples.
Yeah, I think Anne covered a lot of the really good options to reach out to Vietnamese folks who live in areas that have a smaller population or smaller presence within, say, like that city or that town. I think, you know, it is difficult right now with the COVID-19, like, especially with the options of like having advertisements at like restaurants. I think one thing is, you know, if possible, having those restaurants, like when they receive like takeout orders, to have like, if you can hand them like, give them like stacks of pamphlets or like info sheets about the census and ways to fill it out through online or through by phone. If they can like just slip that into the takeout order, I think that's a way to possibly reach out to the communities in those hard to count areas. You know, one option that we were exploring before COVID-19 was also like outreaching to nail salons. You know, that's a really great place to start, and they get a large clientele, and a lot of the workers are Vietnamese. But I think now with the whole situation, you know, that probably isn't feasible for the time being. But other options are, you know, your temples, your churches. I know a lot of churches are starting to go, you know, have church service through Zoom. I believe some temples are also doing that too. You know, you can talk to, you know, the priests of the church or the head monk of a temple. You know, either whether it's a Buddhist temple or like a Gaudai temple. You know, having them relay that message because they are trusted messengers within their community. I think that would be most effective. And I think another one really popular is, you know, the social media, or like the YouTube vloggers, the Vietnamese vloggers. If any of y'all like know of these vloggers, the Vietnamese vloggers, then, you know, having them do a quick shout out and like a quick talk about the census, I think that would be really helpful, because whenever I go home at night, like I always see my mom like on YouTube watching these Vietnamese vloggers, and I think a lot of people are like going to YouTube to look for their Vietnamese news. So I think that's an untapped area that we could probably reach out to. Yeah.
Thank you so much for answering that. Okay, so next question we have is there a list of what federal programs the census will impact as far as funding goes, or at least a visual of how funding is trickled down based on the census?
Oh, I can take that.
Yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
they are. So actually, right now, what I'm holding is like the list of programs that is funded, or that helps determine the funding for different programs in California. I can send a link out for that, but there is also another document that talks about all the programs nationwide, which I can also send out in to the follow-up email. Yeah, because right now, just looking at the California list, within a typical year, California is supposed to use $115 billion for the different programs that they administer. And then if you can imagine like the federal government, that's almost probably a couple $1 trillion. And for each person that isn't counted, that city, that state is going to lose roughly $2,000, and you have a family of 5, and that's $10 or $10,000 just missing for a whole community. So I think it's very crucial that we all are counted. But I can have that list sent to all y'all, or linked to y'all later on.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is, from anecdotal evidence, there's not much awareness among off-campus college students that we need to be filling it out. And there's also a misunderstanding about the importance of international students completing the census as well. Are there efforts being done to reach out to Viet college students, given that college students are a big undercount category? I would be interested in hearing about framing messaging that resonates for college-age Vits and Asian Americans, as well if there's any evidence of that.
I'm going to say that there's an overcount, undercount problem generally for college students, and it doesn't. This is not necessarily something that's unique to the Vietnamese American student population. And this is actually one of the reasons why it's really important that we can invest our energies into educating that particular demographic, because one, they can they need to be educated so that they understand that they need to fill out the census where they're living as of April 1st, or where they would be living if not for COVID-19. But the other is that then they can help their parents, or help explain the importance to their parents. So it really is like a 2-for-1, or 2 birds with 1 stone. I'm actually, Vincent would probably be a better person to talk to speak about the message points that resonate. That has not been the target population for the work that I've been doing per se. But I think at this point, even if people might not be aware of the importance of the census, and they might be apoliticized, they should at least at this point understand that we need an accurate count for the very least emergency preparedness. But I would say that if you're speaking with somebody who has had a lot of, who has benefited from bilingual education, or programs that have, that take into account specific needs for immigrants or refugee children, then I think explaining the census and how it impacts our communities in the way that Vincent actually highlighted very, very well earlier on, I think that's where I would turn to for at least the starting off conversations. I'll pass it off to Vincent. to add more.
So I think in terms of messaging, I have been a part of one focus group that was done by the California Endowment Foundation down in San Diego, and they brought in Vietnamese folks and just kind of threw out like a lot of different messaging to see which one would most resonate. And I think for the majority of folks in that room, it comes down to what can I get from the census now? So I think that being able to, if you know your audience, if you know their situation, I think being able to talk to your friends, being able to talk to your parents, because of that close relationship, that's going to add that level of trust and comfort. So being able to, and then you also know because of that familiarity, you'll know their situation. So if your friends are also in college, that's when you can start saying about the financial aid and loans. For your parents, if say if you have like siblings, you can tell your parents like, hey, my sibling is in high school. A lot of the funding that goes to our high schools are based on census data. So things like that. I think the whole crux of it is know your audience and know what programs might be affecting their lives currently, and being able to tailor that, because I don't really think there's a universal message that will be able to crack everyone's shell and have them go up and take the census, but it's being able to build that trust, and what's better than you yourself actually talking to your folks that you are familiar with. And I think just also answering the point about Vietnamese international students, I do know there has been a lot of folks who over the past month have been going back to Vietnam. So I think those folks are also very crucial in the census, because they live on campus, they live in the surrounding areas, and if they don't get counted, the community loses that funding. So I think just encourage them to go on to the census webpage. You don't have to have any specific access code to fill it out. But I think just have them go through that step and then just fill out that they live. Actually, if they live with a couple of other folks in the same apartment, you just designate one person in your apartment to fill it out for everyone. I think that might be the easiest as like opportunity or choice.
I think also to add to what Vincent said, so if the student, if the person you're talking to is like a college student, isn't really thinking about doesn't really care about how the census might benefit them, if you know them well enough, then I think that you could appeal to the things that actually matter to them, like what Vincent had suggested or already highlighted. But I think if you know something about the person's family situation, right? Like you can appeal to how the census can benefit that person's family or their parents or whatever. So sometimes people care more about, a lot of times people care more about what happens to their loved ones than they do about themselves. And so like if you frame it, if you know that person, you know that's what resonates for that person, then if you frame it in that way, then it removes them from the equation, and then they would actually participate in the census so that it can help somebody else.
All right, thank you so much. So another question we have is, how are people messaging the census parallel to COVID-19? I ask because I've had some people say it's insensitive to push for the census when people are struggling adapting to COVID-19.
So I think for myself, I think it is very a sensitive matter, because a lot of people right now it's like a life or death situation. But I think it's important to like what we talked about throughout the webinars, like being able to think about it long term, and also how it will affect us not only presently but also in the future. And I think the really important thing when you're talking about the census and pairing that with COVID-19 is just talking about all the different you know, healthcare programs that are being funded and that are being used right now in order to kind of address COVID-19. One thing I'm not sure if any folks on the call listened to the New York Times podcast this morning, but they're mentioning about hospital beds and how, hospitals, if they want to build a hospital, they want to increase the bed size or the numbers of beds in the hospital, they have to use census data. And without that, the situation that we're currently in, we don't have enough hospital beds, the kind of bureaucracy to go in and create these makeshift hospitals, that becomes even more difficult if you don't have a clear understanding of, where is that hospital going to be needed to be built, and which areas need it the most. I think another important point is to, if you think about right now, like a lot of folks in the United States are filing for unemployment, right? And another really important aspect that the census data funds is unemployment insurance. So I think right now we don't fill out the census and we aren't active on that. Over the next 10 years, if there is another pandemic, are we as a nation or are we as a community, are we going to be prepared for that? Like in 2010, when people filled out the census, that helped prepare us for, 2020, even though, with current news, we're not that prepared, but I think there's always room to improve and always room to grow. And if we don't have folks filling out the census now, we're going to be much worse off position 5-10 years from now.
All right, thank you so much. So another question we have is, can you repeat if you need to fill out, for the college students, sorry, give me 1 second. Can you repeat if you need to fill out the census if you're a college student living in the dorm or apartment?
So if you're living on campus, then the campus has a process in place to count you. If you're living on off-campus housing, even if you've left the area and went home to stay with your folks because of COVID-19, you should still count yourself at apartment. So not your parents' house. And we understand that some students, left before the forms arrived at their apartments. So, so if they missed their invitation letters with the unique ID code, they can still fill out their census by just inputting their address. But it's really important to make sure that the college students who are living off campus get counted where they at their apartment or where they would have stayed had it not been for COVID-19.
Okay, Vincent, are you talking?
Oh, sorry. So I think just to add on to that is, let me see. Actually, no, I think Anne covered the majority of it. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, no problem. So unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. So the last question is, so what are your best strategies for outreach in the current situation within the community?
Okay, so for VietRise, right now, tomorrow actually, we're going to be starting our phone banking. So what we had to do is, originally it was going to be door-to-door canvassing, but then because of COVID-19, we had to pivot. So we're actually doing phone banking remotely, so that it's going to be our first time doing something like that. Like all our canvassers are going to still be at home. They're going to have their laptops, their phones, their headsets, and then they're going to make calls from there, and then we'll have like a Zoom call like online, just so we can check in with one another. If there are any like issues that pop up. We're also going to be doing text banking. So I think a lot of our outreach efforts is, we're trying to recontact a lot of the community members that we've talked to in the past, say in past elections or past surveys, and building that relationship so that hopefully they see our organization's name and they'll say like, oh, this is a trusted member or a trusted messenger of the community. So we'll kind of fill out the census with them, or kind of answer their questions. So actually, I think if folks on the call, if anyone is living in Orange County right now, or technically be anywhere in the States or the world, if you want to help out with the phone bank or the text bank, send me an email, and then we'll set you up. You just need like your own Google Voice, and then we'll provide the list of numbers to call, and we'll have a script, and then you can go and contact folks from there. But it's mainly going to be contacting folks in Orange County.
We're actually exploring other possibilities. So I'm actually gonna, I think we want to explore a partnership with the school districts in LA County to see if there can be some sort of partnership to have the students participate in some sort of essay or prose or like art contest to promote the census. So we want to tap into the other institutions that are out there that are also working on promoting and encouraging census participation. And then we're also looking into magnifying our social media campaign, either through both through posts, but also through actual media buys, and looking at the outlets and the platforms and the streaming channels that that our communities watch. So like the YouTube, like the vloggers and things like that. So.
All right, thank you everyone. At this time, this formally ends the Q&A session. But if you do have any more questions, both of our panelists' contact information is presented on screen. If your organization would like to still be involved with census efforts, the coalition link, bit.ly/census community call, is the link at which you can sign up for recurring community calls with the entire coalition, where you can talk to other organizations, other organizers who are currently working to make sure that there's a complete count across the entire AAPI community. So any of these links above, you can go out and outreach and come in contact with us. Vincent or Ang, do you have any last words?
Do you want to go?
Let's get our count out, folks. It's just got to happen. We got to do this.
Oh, can I bring up one thing that folks can help that isn't besides phone banking and text banking? I think one really important thing that we have to be aware of is a lot of folks in our community also informal renters. So folks that are like share from paying like under the table. I think those are folks that are highly likely to be undercounted because if you're an owner of a household, you get it. The census you'll fill out for just your family, and sometimes they'll forget the informal renters. So I think that if you know of anyone in that situation, please let them know to fill out the census too. And then one last thing is right now with the efforts to try to extend the deadline of the census, I'm hoping folks here in the calls can call their Congress members to say like, we need to extend the census time in order to make sure that all our communities are counted. And then another portion is, with the census day, it's April 1st, but sometimes if folks decide to fill it out, say in August or in July, they might not remember where they were specifically on April 1st. So we're also hoping to get a change on the census day to closer to the deadline so that people can have a clear picture of how to fill out the census. So if you can talk to your congressional members about that, your senators, I think that's a really important way to make sure our communities are counted.
Sorry, related to what Vincent said about the informal renters, I really want to express, just expand on that point more. So even if, this is one of the things that even if you think that somebody has already responded to the census from that address, if you don't think that you've been counted, just go ahead and fill it out for yourself. And try to also include everybody else that should be counted in that at that address, because after the census is over for our part of it, the Census Bureau will actually go through the data and go through a deduplication process, or they will reconcile the data. So it's totally fine if if there are multiple entries or submissions per house, that will get resolved. As long as, what's important is if you don't think you've been counted, just go ahead and do it, just so that we can make sure. Thank you for bringing that up, Vincent. It's a big, big issue in so many of our communities.
All right, well, at that time, I'd just like to thank both Ang and Vincent again, and then as well as everyone who came onto this call and took time out of your afternoons or evenings to listen in and learn a little bit more about how it impacts our communities, why it's so important, and why we need to get out the count for this year and all future censuses, of course. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.